Well, some of you may be surprised to see me. I'm actually surprised to see me. I got a call on Friday, or a little text message, and asked if I could preach, and so I gladly said that I could. So, hello to all of you here, and hello to all of you Zooming in. Well, a little over a week ago, we celebrated the birth of Christ, and as many have already taken down their decorations, and the anticipation of the season has now waned to the doldrums of normalcy, I thought it might benefit us this morning to hold on to the season just a moment longer, to begin this new year with the same hope with which we finished last year, and to look at a passage many would describe as being a Christmas story. So if you will, turn in your Bibles to Matthew chapter 2, verses 1 through 12. Matthew chapter 2, verses 1 through 12. The story of the three wise men, or the Magi as they are commonly known, is usually in every Christmas play, on Christmas cards, and we sing about them in our Christmas music. We have them in our nativity scenes. But do they really belong there? Many times we find ourselves looking to tradition instead of the Word of God to find out details of the story, and more importantly, how these stories relate to one another. Now, some would think since Matthew ends chapter 1 with the birth of Christ and begins chapter 2 with the story of the Magi, they must have been at Jesus' birth. But we cannot rely on chapter divisions to indicate precise time because the original autographs and later manuscripts did not have the separations we have today. They were placed in the Bible much later in order to make our studies easier. So we must also realize Matthew moves through time very quickly because we see the birth of Jesus in chapter 1 and then he's baptized in chapter 3. So we're missing about 30 years of his life. The Gospel of Luke does give us a glimpse of Jesus when he was 12, but that is all we have concerning the years of Jesus' childhood, his youth, his early manhood. Yet I believe Matthew gives us another account of when Jesus was a very young boy, perhaps even a toddler. So in these verses we have before us this morning, we're going to check that out and we're going to see it. But it may seem strange that Matthew, whose audience was Jewish, would detail a story of Gentiles where Luke, who was a Gentile, would spend more time speaking about Jewish customs, as he did with Joseph and Mary taking Jesus to the temple. But this actually fits with Matthew's theme, and it fits perfectly. Jesus is King. That's Matthew's theme throughout his book. Jesus is King and Messiah, and to most, he's the rejected King and Messiah. So Matthew gives us the birth story in chapter 1, but in chapter 2, Jesus is a little older. The event of the wise men coming to Jesus did not happen at the stable. They did not see him lying in the manger. Jesus was born and then 8 days later was taken to the temple to be circumcised. This is when we meet Simeon and Anna in the Gospel of Luke. This is also when they would give him his name, and this is referenced by Matthew in the last verse of chapter 1, where he writes concerning Joseph, and he called his name Jesus. It would happen on the 8th day. Then sometime later, we have the arrival of the Magi. So the next time you put up your nativity scene, have Joseph and Mary and the baby Jesus and the shepherds near each other, but take the Magi and put them on the other side of the house. That will make it a little bit more realistic. And it will also help in your decorating because, like, what am I going to put there? I'll put the Magi. You can do that, and it would make it more realistic. So, with that knowledge, let's begin in verse 1 of Matthew chapter 2. And we're going to walk through these verses all the way to verse 12. So this morning, let us look together at the Magi's arrival and their adoration of Jesus the King. Matthew chapter 2, 1 through 2 says this. Now after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea, in the days of Herod the king, behold, wise men from the east came to Jerusalem, saying, Where is he who has been born King of the Jews? For we saw his star when it rose and have come to worship him." And there's a large amount of information just in these two verses, so let's begin to unpack it. First, we see that these events happen after Jesus was born. The Magi were not present at the manger. Even if they had arrived on the day of the birth of Christ, there are too many things of which we're going to read about in the next few verses for them to have arrived in Jerusalem, be questioned by Herod, and then travel down to Bethlehem in order to be at the stable. No, these events occur after the birth of Christ. How long after the birth? This we're not sure. It could have been a few weeks. It could have been a few months. It could be up to 2 years. And we'll see why that is as we go through the text. Second, Matthew speaks of the birth of Jesus fulfilling prophecy. He's very quick with this. He says he was born in Bethlehem. Now, he's not as detailed as Luke is concerning what Jesus will be called, what he will do, how it will come about, or how Joseph and Mary arrived in Bethlehem, but he still states the fact that Jesus was born in Bethlehem. Now, he goes into detail in this with verse 5, but it's important that he states it first. And third, we have the time frame of the events. The birth of Christ happened in the days of Herod. And this refers to Herod the Great, who ruled from 37 to 4 BC. Herod was ingenious when it came to architecture and engineering. He began to rebuild the temple in Jerusalem, which took several decades and which was not even completed until many years after his death. And of course, that completed temple did not stand for long because it was destroyed by the Romans in AD 70. Now, although Herod was famous for his construction of buildings, he was just as infamous for the destruction of his family. Herod killed one of his wives out of jealousy and then executed 3 of his sons. The last of these sons tried to have Herod poisoned in 5 BC. And after this, Herod became ill with an incurable disease. His last son actually died 5 days before Herod died. So it's around this time when the events of Matthew 2 take place. Herod died in the spring of 4 BC. So this puts the birth of Christ, as most historians think, between the years of 6 BC and early 4 BC. And last, we're introduced to the Magi, who had come to Jerusalem from the east. So to properly understand why they came to Jerusalem looking for the king, we need to know something about them. The Magi was a group of individuals whose history goes back many centuries. Some historians believe they were around in the time of Abraham. This is a possibility, but we do know they were prominent individuals in the Babylonian Empire, which was about 600 years before the birth of Christ. Now, many today just think of them as astronomers, those who study the stars and their paths, or maybe as astrologers, those who think the stars somehow play a role in a person's destiny. However, the men who belonged to this group were more than just astronomers or astrologers. They not only were in the Babylonian kingdom, but they continued to have a prominent position in the reign of the Medes and Persians, as well as the Greek Empire, and even through the Roman Empire, which is where we find ourselves in Matthew chapter 2. In their time, they were influential in religious life and in government, both legislatively and judicially. In the Medo-Persian Empire, the Magi were very powerful. Historians tell us that no man could become king unless he met 2 conditions. First, he had to master the scientific and religious disciplines of the Magi, and second, he had to be approved and crowned by the Magi. They approved the one to be king. They made him king. They were king makers. But they also provided a balance to the monarchy because they were responsible for appointing judges. So they were very influential members throughout the 4 major empires of world history. And here they were in Jerusalem, looking for one who was born King of the Jews. How did they know about this? And what drew them there? Well, to answer those questions, we need to travel back in time a few hundred years to the Babylonian captivity. The northern kingdom of Israel was taken away by the Assyrians around 722 BC, and the southern kingdom of Judah was left. However, because of their wicked ways, God sent the Babylonians to take them into captivity, transporting them to Babylon in 3 different waves. The first wave around 605 to 603, 597, and then in 586, in which the year the temple was destroyed. So during this time, there were prophets among the Jewish people. Ezekiel and Daniel were present in Babylon. Ezekiel is the one who would tell the people as they went there, and they're like, well, we're not going to be here long. And Ezekiel's like, start building houses. You're going to be here a while. We know about Daniel as well. But the prophets were there. And if the prophets are there, the scriptures were with the prophets. And they were with the people as well. So we encounter the Magi in Daniel chapter 2. You may recall Nebuchadnezzar had a troubling dream, and he called his advisors to tell him the dream and interpret it. Daniel 2:2 states he called the magicians. Now this group consisted of priests who practiced astronomy and astrology, as well as performing sacrifices. Just as an aside, the sacrificial system of these magicians, or what we know as the Magi, was very much like Judaism, where they would kill an animal and burn it on an altar. But these magicians were called by Nebuchadnezzar because they were known for the ability to interpret dreams. They were advisors to the king himself. He trusted in their wisdom. Thus, we get the term wise men. As you recall, no one was able to interpret the dream, but Daniel was able, and he did. And we see the Magi again in Daniel 4, verse 7, and in verse 9, and then again in chapter 5, verse 11. Daniel is called the chief of the magicians, or the wise men, or what we would know today as the Magi. So here's the important question. Did the philosophies and practices of the Magi influence Daniel, or did Daniel influence those of whom he was chief? Well, if you know anything about Daniel, I do not believe he was the one being influenced. Remember, he's the one who openly prayed at his window, refusing to bow down before the idol Nebuchadnezzar had made, and was thrown into a den of lions for this action. He survived because of God's protection, and I think this enabled Daniel to influence the Magi. He was able to relate to them the Scriptures, and this is why they were able to understand the time and place of the birth of the King of the Jews. They understood because they had been taught, primarily by Daniel. So once again, we have to be amazed at the sovereignty and the providence of God, and that while His people are in captivity, that He still makes His Word known, even to those who were Gentiles, who come from pagan backgrounds. So in the midst of the suffering and captivity of His people and the obedience of His prophets, the Lord guides all the intricate pieces of history so that these influential Magi know when His Son is born, and He causes them to come to Him to worship. It was a 600-year process which came to a perfect completion. So hopefully you're starting to understand how important they were and how significant their coming to Jerusalem was. They were more than just a few guys bringing some simple gifts. They were looking for the one who was born King of the Jews because they knew the Scriptures and because they were king makers. It was their job, and it had been for centuries, to recognize and coronate kings. These Gentiles come to seek the King, which is a partial fulfillment of Simeon's words that Jesus would be a light to the Gentiles. And they foreshadow the nations coming to worship Him. Beloved, we can never forget that the plan of God was not just for the Jewish people. It was for all people. All nations will worship Him. Every knee shall bow. This is just the foretaste of the glory that is yet to come. So they arrived in Jerusalem. and they began to inquire about the birth of the king. The word saying, notice in verse 2, saying, where is he who has been born King of the Jews? That word means they were constantly doing this. They were saying, where is he who has been born King of the Jews? And they were saying it over and over. They were causing a stir. They did not go straight to Herod. We see this in verse 3. Herod only hears of this because the Magi have caused a commotion. Well, how could three men asking questions cause a commotion? Well, first, probably more than just three men. We traditionally say three because there were three gifts, and because three skulls were found 1,100 years after the birth of Christ, and the Catholic Church proclaimed them as the skulls of the wise men. It's kind of like the cross, one of the crosses there in the Holy Land. It was one of the queens of, I guess, England or something. They came and saw a piece of wood on the ground and then said, "That's the cross of Christ." And yes, ma'am, sure is. And that's why it's there today. And that's why this is the cross of Christ. Beloved, once again, let's not let tradition or rumors fill our minds so that our theology is out of whack. So we don't know the exact number of the wise men which came to Jerusalem, but we do know from history their importance, as we've spoken of, and how they would travel. These men did not travel on camels and camp out with tiny tents. This would not be a short trip. This is not the road and camping trip, which is pretty much non-existent. I've done it once, and that was plenty for me. They could have traveled around 800 miles. And at a good pace of 20 miles per day, it would take them 40 days to make the journey. So how are they going to carry all those supplies? Well, because of their importance, they probably had servants and cooks and armed guards. These people were important. They're not going to be traveling by themselves. So the number in the entourage could have been several hundred to even a few thousand. So what we see is not three guys on camels asking people in the market a question. Instead, we see a large group of people riding majestic steeds, some with weapons, entering into Jerusalem, asking about a king. With several skirmishes that Herod had to deal with in the past, and his desire to hold on to power, you can see why this caught his attention. So why were they asking? And why did they continue to ask? They may have thought that since they knew of the birth of the king, others would know as well. Certainly the people of the land would know their king had been born, but this was the one they were waiting on. But the Magi arrive, and they ask and keep asking because no one knows what they're talking about. What is interesting is that the wise men come to Jerusalem looking for the king. Now, if they knew the Scriptures, why did they go to Jerusalem and not Bethlehem? Micah foretold the birth of the Messiah in Bethlehem, and if Daniel taught them the Scriptures, they had Micah because he wrote almost 200 years before Daniel wrote his work. Well, why Jerusalem and not Bethlehem? It could have been that some time had passed, and the Magi may have thought that the now toddler king would have been in the capital of Jerusalem and not still in Bethlehem because he's king. This raises the question, another question, of why did Joseph and Mary stay in Bethlehem? Well, perhaps they found no better place to raise the king of David's line than in David's hometown. So as we look back at the text, it's important to note the way they formed the question. They did not say, "Where is the one who will become King of the Jews?" They knew he had a right to the throne because of his birth, because of his lineage. Beloved, this makes the names that Matthew goes over in chapter 1 so very important. We shouldn't look at chapter 1 and just be like, "Oh, names." Yeah. No, they're important. The Magi would know history, and they would know that lineage is important for kings. This is why they are so important for the Jewish readers and for us today. So these names Matthew detailed in chapter 1 are very important. Therefore, because Jesus had the right to the throne, the Magi ask, Where is he who has been born King of the Jews?" So as we continue in verse 2, we see they came from the east, and they came because they had seen his star. Now, there's much speculation about what the star was. Some say it was the lining up of all the planets. I think there's a movie, The Nativity Story. If you watched that a few years ago, I think they line up all the planets and say, ta-da, there's the star. Some say it was the planet Jupiter. Jupiter being the Roman name for Zeus, who was considered the king of the gods. Jupiter was passing by the star Regulus, which is called the king's star, so this would indicate to the Magi that a new king was born. Some say it was a supernova or a comet. Some have suggested that it was something like the Christmas star, which was able to be seen a few days before Christmas this past year. I don't know if you got to see that. It hadn't been seen in over 800 years. My family and I, we went down to the beach to see it. There were a lot of people there. We all had the same idea, apparently, to look at this Christmas star. And I saw it, and after seeing it, I told the other elders it was like the last 20 years of being a fan of Tennessee football. It was really high expectations, but not so great results. But as I was looking at it, I told my family, nothing like this Christmas star, even though it is unique, could have guided the wise men. Additionally, none of these explanations can explain what happens after the Magi meet Herod. So we'll see in just a little while, but we do need to see that not only what brought the Magi to Jerusalem, but why they came. The star brings them, but why? They said, "For we saw his star in the east and have come to worship him." Most likely, many of the Magi did not follow the teachings of Daniel, which is not surprising when even many of the Jews did not follow them. They had their own pagan worship prior to his being chief over them, and then later on when King Darius, the Medo-Persian Empire, introduced new religions, they probably followed that as well. But there had to be some who followed Daniel's instruction. Not just concerning monotheism, because they were monotheists, which was unique, but monotheism concerning the one true God. These men were most likely part of that group. They had come to worship him. They want to worship. They want to give homage to this king. And by doing so, they will worship the one true God. Verse 3 tells us this: "When Herod the king heard this, he was troubled, and all Jerusalem with him." And we can certainly understand why Herod would be troubled by this. He was appointed the ruler by Caesar. Now, apparently one has been born who is entitled to the throne, not simply appointed. This was troubling to him because he did not want to lose his power. But why was all Jerusalem troubled with him? It was not because they did not want the Messiah to come. It was not because they enjoyed the rule of Herod. They were troubled because of what Herod would do in response to this news. We must remember this man was known for killing his wife and children because he thought they opposed him. If there was one born as king, this meant terrible things for the citizens of that region. And sadly, this comes to fruition in Matthew as he records the slaughter of the children by order of Herod in chapter 2, verse 16. But what's interesting about the end of verse 2 and the entirety of verse 3 is that the responses of the Magi and Herod are like two ends of the spectrum of the reactions everyone has when they hear that there is a king. For Herod, it is as if the Magi were saying to him this: there is a king, one who's born in this role, not appointed, one who is to rule. And Herod, that king is not you. This king has the right to rule. And this right includes his lordship over you. You know, for many, this is troublesome because the same thing can be said to them. There is a king. There is a ruler of your life, and you are not him. You see, they're troubled because they fear losing the power they think they have over their own lives. They want to hold on to the delusion that they are truly in charge of their lives. Others hear of the king and willfully and joyfully submit to his lordship. And by his grace, by him opening their eyes, they know they have no power, they have no authority, they have no charge of their lives. This is like the Magi. You see, their desire is not to hold on to power. They're not troubled. They simply want to worship. So the question is, which one are you? Do you really think? Do you really think you're in charge? Do you really think you're in control of your life? How long will you live with that delusion? Or will you be like the one who freely admits, I'm nothing. I'm nothing. And I just need to worship. You see, when Herod hears the news, we can see in verse 4 that he gathered together all the chief priests and all the scribes of the people, and he inquired of them where the Christ was to be born. The priests and the scribes, who were proficient in their knowledge of the Old Testament, they came before Herod and gave him the answer. Matthew 2, 5 and 6 says this, They told him, In Bethlehem of Judea, for so it is written by the prophet, And you, O Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah, for from you shall come forth a ruler who will shepherd my people Israel. Matthew records the prophecy of Micah 5:2, and there's a combination of 2 Samuel 5:2 as well. Why does Matthew do this? Well, he's quoting them. But Matthew may be showing how this king who was born in Bethlehem, the city of David, will be like David, but greater. He could also be contrasting the true shepherd with the false shepherds, the priests and the religious leaders of Israel. He could also be contrasting the rule of Herod with the rule of the one born king. Herod was harsh and cruel. Jesus would be a shepherd who would seek the lost, bring back the strayed, bind up the injured, strengthen the weak, and destroy the strong. He would care for them, lead them, feed them. But I believe there is also an allusion to Ezekiel 34, when he mentions the ruler being a shepherd. You see, it's important to notice the idea of the Messiah being a shepherd. In Ezekiel 34, verse 23, the Lord says this, I will set up over them one shepherd, my servant David, and he shall feed them, and be their shepherd. But interestingly, in Ezekiel 34:15, the Lord declares this, I myself will be the shepherd of my sheep, and I myself will make them lie down. He could be certainly indicating that the shepherd born in Bethlehem will be both appointed by God and be God Himself. And I say this because of what is in the context of Micah 5:2. Matthew records what the religious leaders told Herod in Micah 5:2. But they did not go on. They stopped in the middle of the sentence. This is what Micah 5:2 says in its entirety. But you, O Bethlehem, who are too little to be among the clans of Judah, from you shall come forth for me one who is to be ruler in Israel, whose coming forth is from of old, from ancient days. Now, from of old and from ancient days are referencing this one's Davidic lineage, but it could also indicate that this one pre-existed. Therefore, the one to come would be both human and divine. So when Herod finds out the information he needed, we come to verse 7. Then Herod summoned the wise men secretly and ascertained from them what time the star had appeared. He called them secretly, perhaps because he did not want to give away any inclination of his plot to the religious leaders of the Jews. Yet, it is interesting that Matthew gives no indication that the Jewish religious scholars and leaders had any interest in what the wise men were saying and for what reason Herod had called them together. If the Magi and Herod have the two ends of the spectrum when it comes to reactions about the knowledge of a king, of trouble and submission to worship, then the religious leaders seem to fall right in the middle. It appears they were apathetic about it all. What we see from them is inaction, the very opposite of the Magi. No one moves. Not one person goes. Does it not seem odd that not one religious leader girds up his loins and runs to Bethlehem? And for that matter, were they even watching with hopeful expectation every male child born in Bethlehem? I mean, if you knew that's where the king would be born, wouldn't like every time a baby was born in Bethlehem, you're like, I wonder if that's him. That might be him. That might be the one. But they don't go. They don't care. Why? Well, perhaps they too were afraid of losing the power they had gained by their positions. Perhaps it was as simple as this. They did not believe. They had the Scriptures. They knew about the Scriptures. They knew all the facts about the Scriptures, but they did not have faith in what the Scriptures said, nor was the action that always accompanies faith present in them. No one goes. You hear this announcement. You see this commotion. There's a king that's been born, and as a religious leader, you're like, yeah, he's going to be born in Bethlehem. I'll stay here. It's sad, but true. So Herod believed he could find out the exact date the star appeared. If he could find that out, he could end the life of this one who was born king. Well, what was the exact time? Well, we don't know. But what we can see is that Herod was not going to take any chances. We see in verse 16, if you look there, that Herod slew all the male children in Bethlehem and its vicinity, just to make sure, from 2 years old and under, according to the time which he had determined from the Magi. Now in his mind, if the star appeared close to 2 years prior, it could have appeared to announce the birth of the king, or it could have appeared before the king's birth in order for the Magi to arrive when the king was born. So it's either going to be, it's appearing right when he's born, or 2 years prior to when he was born. So according to Herod's logic, if he killed every male child who was 2 years old and younger, that would cover it. Look in verse 8. Herod gives no hint of his plan to the Magi. Instead, unbeknownst to them, he sent the Magi to Bethlehem in order for them to be his unknowing scouts. He tells them, go and search diligently for the child, and when you found him, bring me word that I too may come and worship him. Of course, Herod had no plans to worship. His only wish was to destroy. Matthew records in verse 9 and 10, after hearing the king, they went their way, and the star which they had seen in the east went on before them until it came and stood over the place where the child was. And when they saw the star, they rejoiced exceedingly with great joy. They leave the presence of Herod, and the familiar star is seen again. So I believe this star was something supernatural. I know Mark mentioned that last week or so, a couple of weeks ago. And I say this for a couple of reasons. First, the Magi see it and follow it, but nobody else seems to know about it. They could have just shown Herod the star that night, couldn't they? Herod, if you'll just wait a little bit, and the star is going to show right there, and ta-da, you'll know exactly where he is. But they didn't. Could it be that when they came near Israel, that they no longer saw the star? And this is why they came to Jerusalem, to the capital? Could it be that they had not seen it for some time, and when it reappeared, this is why they were overjoyed? Maybe, just maybe, they are overjoyed because they thought this star, which had guided them from the east, had just vanished, and they thought they would never see it again. But as they journeyed to Bethlehem, just about 5 miles south from Jerusalem, the star was visible to them, and it led them to the very place where Jesus was. And this is the second reason I think the star was something supernatural. You can look at stars in the sky and they can guide you. I don't really know how to do that, but I hear that's the case. I can find the North Star and I guess I can go north, but other than that, I'll just be going in circles. But they're so far away and they're so far up, can we really say that they're just standing over the place where someone is? I mean, if you look at the North Star, it doesn't just stand over a place, it looks like it's standing over an area. And if you were to go to that area, guess what? It looks like it's standing over an area that's way past there again. And if you go to that area, you're just like, I'm not getting any closer with this thing. So it couldn't just stand over a house. So this star leads them to the exact house where Jesus was. And by the way, the word star here, that's translated as star, could also simply just imply something that is ablaze. Could it be that the star was familiar to, if not the very glory of God, residing over the place where Jesus, the Son of God, was staying? The glory of God shone when the angels gave their announcement to the shepherds. Could this star be the glory of God? It could be. But I think with what we do know, even though there's a lot that we don't know, we can correctly surmise that this was no ordinary star, nor was it something physical in the astronomical world. Nothing, no planet, no supernova, no comet, no star could have reappeared and brought them directly to the house where Jesus was. This was something supernatural. The wise men had a guiding light to the incarnate Word. Yet, beloved, do we not have something greater? Do we not have the very Word of God, which leads us not just to the toddler Jesus, the one-born King of the Jews, but to the King of glory, the perfect man, the perfect sacrifice, the perfect high priest, the perfect risen Savior who is Lord of all the nations? And as the wise men rejoiced when they saw this great light once again that would lead them to this Christ child, should we not be overwhelmed with joy when we have this Word, this lamp unto our feet and light unto our path that points us towards Him every time we read from its pages? They would be guided to a child and would only imagine the possibilities of what He would do. But we have a record of what He has accomplished and everything we need pertaining to life and godliness. May we not be like the chief priests and scribes, who, having access to the Scriptures, had no interest in knowing the one to whom they pointed. May we instead be like the Magi, who were overjoyed to be guided directly to the King. In verse 11, the Magi were able to fulfill their desire of worshiping the King of the Jews. Matthew records, "And going into the house, they saw the child with Mary, His mother, and they fell down and worshipped Him. Then opening their treasures, they offered Him gifts, gold and frankincense and myrrh." Just a few observations here. Once again, we don't know how old Jesus was at this time, perhaps a few weeks to a few months, up to 2 years of age. The word translated child does not help us much because Luke uses the same word to describe a newborn Jesus, but Matthew does use this same word in reference to toddlers when he writes. We can also see that the family is now in a house, so they have left the stable to be in a more permanent dwelling. But I want you to notice this, how Matthew gives priority to Jesus the child over Mary. Jesus' name, the child, is first. Mary's name comes second. And who did they worship? Him, not them. Just Him. The Magi have arrived. And now we see their adoration. The Magi fell to the ground. These were mighty men, influential men, kingmakers, and they humbled themselves, falling to the ground. They prostrated themselves to give proper adoration to this child. They worshiped Him. And only after worshiping Him did they offer their gifts. I think we see the priority of the Magi in this. If they only wanted to give gifts, they would have done that first. But what did they tell Herod? They wanted to worship this king. They did not mention their gifts. They worshiped first, then offered their gifts. Beloved, I think we can apply this. to our lives. You know, many times we give financial gifts, or we wish to give ourselves to Christ, becoming the living sacrifices we are supposed to be. But we can do these things properly only if we have worshiped first. You cannot properly and honestly give what you have and give yourself to Christ and desire Him to work in you unless you have desired Him. You can serve in the church, and we'd like for you to serve in the church. But unless you are worshiping Him, unless you've done that first, your service is faulty. You should want to be involved in the ministries of this church. When I was pastoring up in North Carolina, I may have told you this before. I can't remember, so you probably can't either. But I told my congregation, I said, I want you to be a sponge. I want you to soak in everything that we talk about through the Scriptures, everything. But I want you to be a scouring sponge. I want you to work. I need you to be involved. I need you to have a stake in the ministry. And just not let just a few people do things. We want you to be involved. But before you can do that, you need to be worshiping. If you're not a worshiper, you really don't need to be a worker. Serving in ministry should come not from obligation, but from the overflow of worship. So concerning these gifts which were given, many people have tried to tie them to the person of Christ, His roles, His work. You've probably heard that the gold was given because He is royalty, the frankincense was given because He was priest, the myrrh was given because it was perfume used on the dead. If that was all that myrrh was used for, it'd be a little overwhelming for Joseph and Mary, don't you think? I've heard it once said that if bringing myrrh to the child at that age would be like bringing a coffin to a baby shower. That'd make you think. It's a little strange. But if that's what myrrh was only used for, maybe we can see that. And I know that we symbolize a lot. But did the Magi think all the way through this? Did they give these gifts to purposely symbolize these roles and future acts of the child? Now, one might conclude the answer in a positive fashion if these gifts were used only for those purposes. Gold was certainly given to kings. Frankincense, however, was not only used in religious ceremonies, but in weddings. Myrrh was used on dead bodies, but it was also used as a perfume. It was used in weddings as well. And when mixed with wine, it was used as an antiseptic. So the symbolism could be there, gold for a king, frankincense for God, and myrrh for mortal man. And this would summarize who Jesus was. King, priest, God, and man, all at the same time. The Magi may not have thought all the way through that, but perhaps they did. Perhaps they did understand what the Scriptures taught, that the Messiah would be cut off from His generation. Perhaps they did understand in some ways passages like Isaiah 53 and Psalm 22 and the weeks of Daniel chapter 9. We don't know how much knowledge they had. But with what they did know, they were willing to worship. Maybe this is how we can apply it. There is a range of knowledge concerning biblical things, of theology in a congregation. I don't know how much you know. You don't know how much I know. But with the knowledge we have, two things should happen, no matter how much we know. You should want to worship, and you should want to pursue this King to find out more about Him. We should never be content in our knowledge of Him. The more you know about Him through His Word, the better your worship will be. So we can't be sure, but what we can confidently surmise is this: these gifts came at the right time. Joseph and Mary probably had close to nothing. They were poor, and this is why they gave 2 turtle doves at the temple when Jesus was 8 days old. Unless something had changed dramatically since then, they're still in financial straits. And in just a few hours after this event, they're going to journey to Egypt, and they're going to stay there, and then they're going to come back. What would they do for their finances? I think they would use these gifts. Verse 12 tells us, and being warned by God in a dream not to return to Herod, they departed to their own country by another way. Now, there's no need to spiritualize this. I've heard it said that they went home another way because once they came in contact with Jesus, everything changed. Well, yeah, but I don't think we should spiritualize it. They couldn't go back the same way because they were different? Maybe. It sounds interesting, but I think it misses the point. They were warned in a dream. They had been following a star, the supernatural blaze, but now God warns them directly. He was protecting them and He was protecting His Son from the wrath of Herod. Tragedy would soon strike Bethlehem, but the incarnate Word of God would be preserved. The Magi were obedient to God's warning. I think that's the way we apply this. It's not that they were just different. It's that they were obedient. They worshiped and they were obedient. I think we should emulate that, don't you? Worship and obedience. We don't know exactly what route they took, but they went a different way, avoiding Jerusalem. They returned to their homeland, most likely still in awe of what they had seen. And it is very likely they were able to tell others about the events that they had seen. They inquired about Him. They came to Him. They worshiped Him. They gave to Him. And they took the knowledge about Him with them to their own country. Beloved, the questions are these. Have we done this? Have we inquired about Him? Do we really want to know who He is? Do we really want this King ruling our lives? Have we truly come to Him? Not to a building, not to a fellowship, but to Him. Have we truly worshiped Him? Have we bowed our hearts before Him and acknowledged Him as King? Have we given to Him what is rightfully His, our very lives? Have we given to Him all that we have and all that we are? I hope we have. Will we be obedient to His commands? Will we take the knowledge we have about Him and share it with those around us? I hope we will. The Magi, more than just a story, an example for us to pursue the King, to worship, and to obey.